500,000 dead Russians in Ukraine and counting. Weapons in a stalemate. Is legislation more important than lives? International troops in Ukraine, how real is that? Good afternoon. There are more in this weekly episode, and that means hard truth in easy terms by me, Henry Keane, and UATV English team, done for the whole free world, directly from Ukraine. 500,000 lives lost, Russian lives, is nothing for Russia, really. Less than nothing. 1 million, maybe 2, 10 million, who cares? Why the Kremlin should even bother about those Buryats, Koryaks, and any indigenous peoples of their lands far, far away from the Kremlin. They're just disposables. That would be a very interesting experiment, by the way, if those hundreds of thousands of Russians dead in Ukraine would be Russians who originally came from Moscow or St. Petersburg regions. The Kremlin obviously wants rural people of Russia to die in Ukraine and not noble Muscovites. Sure thing. Better those Udmurts, says the Kremlin. Those Tatars. Better those Chechens, Buryats, and more than 90 other indigenous peoples of Russia. Because the Kremlin utterly believes that ethnic Russians just do not care about how many non-ethnic enough Russians will die for a great Russian cause. You see, Russia truly is a great country. You can't choose the way you live in this great Russia, yes, but you can always choose the way you die. Oh my God, how great is that? Hey you, rural Russian. Hey you, Russian inmate, volunteer mobilized. Any of you can finally die for a reason. That is on Ukrainian land for the Kremlin's cause. But even that is even better than living in Russia, right? Living in Russia is no good. There is nothing else out there in Russia waiting for you other than death by vodka, says President Putin.
Некоторые ведь живут или не живут непонятно, и как уходят от водки там или еще от чего-то.
Whatever indicted Russian Tsar says, here is what says Ukraine in turn. Russia lost in Ukraine. Personnel more than 500,000. Tanks 7,662. Armored combat vehicles 14,800. Artillery systems 12,953. MLRS 1,083. Air defense systems 814. Aircraft 357. Helicopters 326. Tactical UAVs 10,425. Cruise missiles 2,209. Warships and boats 27. Submarines 1. Automoto and tank tracks 17,639. Special equipment 2,111. And plans to seize Ukraine in 3 days 1. The world also observes closely and makes its own calculations. Don't believe us, just watch. France estimates Russia's total losses in the war in Ukraine at 500,000 people, of which 150,000 were killed, says Stéphane Séjourné, the French foreign minister, calling it, I quote, a military failure of Russia. Earlier, the British Minister of Defense stated that Russia's losses in the war exceeded 450,000 people. I don't really remember. Was it the Russian Ministry of Invasion or the Ministry of Russian Plunder, Rape and Murder that says they have lost only 54,000 Russians? Right. You know, I'm almost ready to believe that. If we take the figure the world says 500,000 lost and what Russia says 54,000, then I know what the difference of 450,000 dead people is. These people were simply not Russian enough for the Kremlin to consider them worth mentioning. Let's take it step by step. I hear those voices. What about that Russian assault in Kharkiv? Were those defense lines made by Ukrainians? What is going on in Ukraine? We send our money there. Where are the defense lines? And so on and so forth. So UATV English is going to break the hard truth to easy terms for you as usual. Indeed, there were almost no defense lines within artillery range of the border because there can be no defense line within enemy's artillery range. I mean, it's the artillery range, after all. So any heavy construction equipment required to build the defense line was obviously met by a barrage of incoming Russian fire. So most of the construction had to be carried out by hand and at night. I repeat, by hand and at night. So when Russian troops finally crossed the border on May 10th, they used heavy artillery fire from within Russia to support their advance. Please remind me why even then the Ukrainians were unable to fire back with a most effective American-made weapon? Oh, right, because of a restriction of the West that Russians were both well aware of and absolutely happy to exploit. So here is it in easy terms. Most Russian artillery in the Kharkiv region is located in Belgorod region, that is inside Russia. The American system firing a standard payload has a range of around 43 miles, which is significantly longer than the majority of Russian artillery, which makes it safe for our warriors to use it. But Ukraine has been granted a weapon that couldn't fire. The condition was not to attack Russian territory. Farewell to arms, pardon me, Mr. Hemingway, to literally sit on arms that can save you from the aggressor. Watching him invading your country and not be able to use these very arms that should be probably called a Ukrainian syndrome during all future international military tactics and strategy lessons. It's absurd. We in Ukraine watched for weeks as the Russians massed near the Ukrainian border, unable to use the US-supplied weapons to conduct a preemptive strike due to Washington's policy.
How do we respond when they strike our cities, knowing that they are using the civilian population as cover because their weapons are located among the civilian population of the Russian Federation? But they proceed calmly, understanding that our partners do not give us permission. And here, when we talk about ATACMS or HIMARS, or we talk about artillery shells, or the relevant missiles, Storm Shadow, Scalp and so on, we do not have permission to strike at the territory of the Russian Federation, at their military facilities, headquarters, etc. Volodymyr Zelensky, President of Ukraine, in an interview with the New York Times.
That literally means that to be able to use American weapons to free our land, we have to invite Russians to occupy more of our land and then use American weapons to free our land back. You know, usually you are asking me hard questions. Now please, let me ask you, dear world, in turn this time, what would you call this phenomenon? Please, make yourself at home in the comments below. Let's discuss international troops in Ukraine, pros and cons. According to the New York Times, Ukraine has asked the United States and other allies to help train 150,000 Ukrainian troops closer to the front line to speed up their deployment. Well, not that I'm aware of that Ukraine literally asked for it. Instead, we are kind of discussing the options, cons and pros. The pros are obvious. If sent, American instructors could have quickly gather information on changes on the Ukrainian front, potentially allowing them to adapt their training in real time. Cons for the West are same obvious. An attack on allied trainers in Ukraine could lead to the invocation of NATO's Collective Defense Article 5. One for all and all for one, remember?
So far, the United States has said no, but General Charles Brown Jr., the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said that a NATO deployment of trainers appeared inevitable, from the article of the New York Times.
But what about us, Ukraine? Did we really ask for it? Do we need international troops in Ukraine?
Training in Ukraine is logical. We have already talked about it. Rather than going, for example, to France, even to Poland, and then cooperation in demining, it is possible to create a hub for the repair of French, for example, equipment directly in Ukraine, so as not to send it to France. Volodymyr Zelensky, President of Ukraine.
We are living in a hypocrite world, and we all know it because we all have to build it. In this world, United Nations stands in a minute of mourning over a death of a bloodthirsty monster, a religious fanatic and a sadistic murderer, Ibrahim Raisi, who hanged a 13-year-old children on a construction crane in the name of his version of God. So one thing amongst these cons and pros in terms of sending or not sending troops to Ukraine, for the world is obviously good. The world talks about it. That means it at least cares. That gives hope. Some at least. Time for more on UATV English. You ask hard questions, we answer in easy terms. The question of the week has been sent by our viewer Craig3949. And the question sounds like this. These ships are cheap? Why they let them get sunk so easy? Oh my, please let me be more specific today. The question deserves it. All right. Let us all start with a beautiful reminiscence of a flagship named Moscow that went down to the bottom of the Black Sea after it was hit by a Ukrainian missile. A missile fired from the shore, by the way. So again, and if you, just like me, are not much of an expert in marine combat tactics and strategy, even so, you must simply logically be absolutely sure a giant flagship should not be sent to the Bikini Bottom by an outnumbered and out-armed enemy. And if it is the case, well, then something is very wrong with Mother Russia. And I can tell you what exactly. Nobody cares about Russians in Russia. Yes, you heard me just right. We in Ukraine expect nothing but hatred and genocide and awful war crimes from Russia because for centuries we know what Russia is. And only in February 2022, the world joined us and started to, way too slowly if you ask me, to understand what we always knew. Russians do not care about life in general. Any life. Russian life in particular. Remember what Putin said about a Russian sub Kursk after a foreign journalist asked him what happened to a submarine.
Она утонула.
She sank. A goddamn nuclear super-duper high-tech modern submarine just sank. Like that. And after it did, the Kremlin never even allowed any international help to save those trapped mariners who could have been saved, but were doomed by Putin personally, who sentenced them for excruciating death for days trapped on a hundreds meters down below sea surface. I wonder what these Russian mariners were thinking about Putin personally. The very moment they understood what we in Ukraine always knew. Not him, Putin, no Mother Russia, give a damn about their lives. And Russians never even considered what happened a spit to the face of the nation. Maybe that means there is no face. In fact, some even liked it. They were fond of Putin's Tsarek humor. After all, a sub did sunk, right? I guess. Remember Joseph Stalin? One who murdered tens of millions of Russians in terrible death camps and prisons. Well, go Google it and listen to what modern Russians are saying these days about him. About a man who murdered millions of them. It turns out Stalin was not at all a bloodthirsty monster, but a dictator or a psychopathic dictator. No, Stalin was a great manager with a strong hand. And this is exactly why they, Russians, love Putin, because he's Stalin-like. So you see, dear Craig 3949, it is not about Russian warships being so cheap that the Kremlin does not care about it in particular. No, the Kremlin does not care about Russia in general. It's not Russian warships, it's Russian lives that are cheap. And Russians just accept it. And this is exactly why they're going to lose not only this war, but their own future. Well, that seems to be all, folks, for tonight and for the week. For news on Ukraine, please stay with Ukraine. It was me, Henry Keane, in UATV English studio, breaking the hard truth, easy terms for the whole free world, directly from Ukraine. We like you, and we hope the feeling is mutual, so please, like us in return, subscribe and share, help us to promote Ukrainian voice worldwide. Stay safe and tuned for more right already tomorrow with me and my dear colleagues of UATV English. Goodbye.